Middle-way philosophy, introductory video 6C, integration of belief, the development of wisdom and compassion by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 6 in this series on integration. Throughout many world cultures, the attribute of wisdom has been greatly valued. But what is wisdom? What do we mean by wisdom? Very often it's associated with experience, and yet not all those who have experienced are wise. It seems to be related to the capacity to learn from experience, which also suggests that wisdom involves not being derailed or not being distracted by things that lie beyond experience. That's at the heart of the account of wisdom I want to give here, which is that it's based on the integration of belief. Popularly, people often relate the term belief particularly to religious belief, such as the belief that Jesus is the Son of God. However, such absolute beliefs are only a very small subset of the beliefs that we encounter in our lives and make use of in our lives. A belief occurs whenever we affirm a claim which represents the world in some way or denies something that we believe to be the case or not the case about the world. So, this is a badger is a belief. Badgers don't have wings is a belief. This badger is looking for food is another belief. It may also be that the badger itself has beliefs. For example, it may believe that there's food in the locality. Beliefs are created from meanings, and as described in the previous video on integration of meaning, meanings consist of synaptic connections that allow us to associate a symbol of some kind with an experience of some kind, which we can then reprise whenever we come across either the symbol or the experience. Belief, then, is a particularly entrenched kind of meaning. Some of those synaptic connections become especially habitual, especially firm, when they are used as a basis of action. Whenever we act, we have to assume that a certain state of affairs is the case, and we have to assume certain goals being the right ones for those circumstances. That's a set of beliefs which we can understand as a set of meanings that have become particularly dominant. As soon as we get into the habit of believing those certain things in those certain circumstances, then it's very likely that we will continue going along those entrenched paths. Our energy can flow along them more easily the more we have gone along those paths before. So, belief is not something separate from meaning, it's merely meaning with broader paths, meaning used in action. If we take this kind of view of belief, then belief does not have to be explicit. Of course, it does have to be the basis of an action, or at least of a potential action. It has to be strong enough to be the basis of an action. But if you think about the kinds of claims that we may have beliefs in, those claims may not be entirely explicit all the time in any case. And the idea of explicitness is an incremental thing. Things can be more or less explicit, not absolutely explicit. Let's take my belief that the duck-billed platypus is a type of mammal. Just stating that sentence, I believe that the duck-billed platypus is a type of mammal, takes a certain amount of time. During that time, my attention shifts. It shifts from believing to duck-billed platypus to mammal. Exactly what I have in my mind at different points when I'm saying that sentence may be quite varied. I may not have the whole thing consciously and explicitly in mind the whole time. There's always a great deal in the background, what we might call pre-conscious awareness, that is present when we hold a particular belief. And of course, the vast majority of the time, most of our beliefs are unconscious or preconscious in the sense that we are not explicitly reflecting on them. But it is conflicting beliefs that create the problems for us as human beings. Conflicting beliefs, whether these are internal, that is, a view that we have at one time conflicts with one we have at another, or perhaps one that we hold unconsciously, or externally, that is, we have conflicting beliefs with somebody else, or two different groups have conflicting beliefs. In any of those cases, the conflict is created by absoluteness. There's an absolute positive claim of some kind, that something is the case, versus an absolute negative, that something is not the case. It is provisional beliefs, on the other hand, that are capable of integration. That's because a provisional belief, not being absolute, allows for alternatives to the belief that is held. It's not opposed to an opposite, but rather is able to critically engage with alternatives and help us reach a justified conclusion. If we put together different provisional beliefs, even if in some respects they're apparently conflicting to start with, through their provisional form, it becomes possible to reach an integrated belief. The two mules pictures, which I've used in all these videos about integration, show clearly the process of conflicting beliefs and how those conflicts can be overcome through integration. If we focus on the middle two pictures, in the third picture, the two mules are in a state of conflict in which they have opposed absolute beliefs. While they're still in that absolutizing state, they can only consider their belief that they ought to eat one pile of hay, and this is absolutely opposed to the other mule's desire to eat the other pile of hay. It's only when they come together and reconsider and reframe the situation that they are able to move out of absolute beliefs into provisional beliefs, which enable them to address the situation far better. That's what happens in the fourth picture. Absolute beliefs are fragile because as long as we remain within the straitjacket of absolute thinking, we can only either accept or reject the absolute belief in a binary fashion. It's either true or it's false in its current form. It can't adapt into another form, or it can only do so if we move out of absolute thinking and make some sort of connection with a more provisional way of thinking. One basic condition creating that fragility, as discussed already in the What's Wrong with Metaphysics video, is the relationship between the individual and the group, which is enshrined in the metaphysical belief. Acceptance of the metaphysical belief becomes a condition of group acceptance. So either the individual accepts the metaphysical belief and thus becomes part of the group, or if they were to question that belief, they would be threatening their status in the group. If the group is rigid in relation to its application of the belief, which is very likely if it's an absolute belief, then the individual will be expelled if they do not accept the metaphysical belief. So here's a summary of how absolute beliefs maintain conflict. The meaning of the belief is dependent on a relationship to reality. That's what's known as representationalism. Because it's dependent on a relationship to reality, the belief is considered to be either wholly true or wholly false. That's what creates the basis of its fragility. That means that you're either in with the group if you accept the belief, or out of it if you don't. The further implication of that then is that alternatives to those opposing absolutes are repressed. So any third positions which may help to overcome a conflict are not at all considered. The integration of belief involves following the middle way of integrating provisional beliefs. In order to be able to integrate provisional beliefs, you've got to sort them from associated metaphysical beliefs. So, on the one hand, on either side, we have to avoid both positive and negative metaphysics. But on the other, we also need to be able to accept and maintain engagement with the meanings and the provisional beliefs which may be associated with those metaphysical beliefs. That's where a careful critical process of picking out the absolute beliefs becomes necessary. I'll now give you a couple of examples. My first example is the integration of beliefs about God. In order to integrate those beliefs, we first of all need to be clear about the metaphysical beliefs, which will otherwise block any kind of integration of belief. So on the one hand, we need to avoid accepting the belief that God exists. But at the same time, meanings associated with God, so the idea of God itself, for example, can be maintained and engaged with, and also provisional associated beliefs. So people have religious experience can also be accepted. We don't have to deny anything about people's experiences in order to avoid absolute beliefs about God. But there's also an opposite side which we'll need to deal with even-handedly. So we'll need to avoid the negative metaphysics of God does not exist. At the same time, we'll need to separate that from any associated meanings or provisional beliefs. So an example of an associated meaning might be autonomy. We might think of that as something that's very meaningful to us, which might be opposed to God in our imaginations. We might think that God is in some way opposed to our ability to rule ourselves. Or the observation that religious experience occurs in the brain. Now, there can be rigid metaphysical interpretations of that statement, but just the observation that it occurs in the brain is not in itself metaphysical. So if we leave those provisional statements and meanings open, reflect on them using the middle way, we're likely to be left with agnosticism about God's existence. That is, not just waiting on new information, which will never come, but rather a recognition that we will never know either way whether or not God exists, together with a non-reductive investigation of the archetypal experiences that are associated with God. But to show that the integration of belief is not simply about religious issues, but also covers every other area of human experience, let's also look at another example. This one is socialism. Closely associated with socialism is the belief in social justice. And whether that's an absolute belief depends very much on whether it's absolutized, that is, whether it's taken to overrule all other values so that they're no longer considered. So, on the one hand, there's a positive metaphysics to be avoided here, in the form of something like social justice overrules all other values. Or the other extreme, the negative metaphysics, will be social justice is of no value. If we avoid those extremes, there's still something to be gained, both from socialism and from other opposed traditions. So we can keep the value of social justice, we can keep it as a meaningful thing to believe in, but we can weigh it with other values. But we can also take other political priorities, such as freedom or loyalty, from other political traditions. Putting those together, we can try and find a middle way. That will involve rejecting political extremism of all kinds with absolutized values. It will also mean seeking a balance of political values that best addresses conditions once you've avoided the absolutizations. Apart from these explicit metaphysical beliefs, though, the integration of belief also involves working with a whole set of implicit cognitive biases and fallacies, which involve distortions to our judgment on an everyday basis. In many cases, we're not aware of those distortions. We're very often overconfident in believing that we've got our judgment right, without recognizing or taking into account the biases that we're subject to. It's that overconfidence that provides the basis of absolutization in relation to a bias. So, although there may well be aspects of many biases that are just part of the conditions and we can't do anything about, what we can do something about is the absolutization of our response. Usually that means being deceived by the bias and remaining confident that we're right. However, there's also a negative metaphysical opposite, which is an overreaction to the bias, an assumption that because the bias is present, therefore any judgment we make in that area must be wrong. Somewhere in between then, the middle way involves a recognition of the bias, but a flexible compensation for the bias. For example, let's take the illusion of control. This is a cognitive bias that leads people to overestimate their degree of control over things that they operate. It particularly applies to driving, and people who, for example, use their mobile phone whilst driving tend to overestimate their remaining degree of control over the car, despite the division of their attention. The extremes involved then in the illusion of control are the belief either you're entirely in control, despite whatever distractions you may be subjecting yourself to, or the alternative reaction would be that you're not in control at all, to overcompensate for the illusion of control. The middle way would be to recognise that generally you're not quite as much in control as you tend to assume you are, and therefore obviously not to take undue risks. There are a great many cognitive biases and fallacies that can distort our beliefs and thus prevent us integrating them in this sort of way. So there are so many that it's quite impossible to discuss them all here in the space of a short video. However, if you want fuller details of a listing, in fact, of all the cognitive biases, please see my book Middle Way Philosophy 4, The Integration of Belief. I've also produced a series of videos called Mistakes We Make in Thinking, which focus on fallacies and cognitive biases. The idea that wisdom is gained by balancing between different absolutes and integrating what lies between them is quite an ancient one. Take, for example, this Buddhist mandala, the mandala of the 5 Buddhas. Each of the 5 Buddhas represents a different kind of wisdom. If you took that wisdom to be absolute, to be the only kind of wisdom that we should cultivate, that belief would take you out to an extreme. But if you're to integrate that wisdom with the other kinds of wisdom, then you need to recognize that it's only one type of wisdom which needs to be engaged in a dialectical process with other kinds of wisdom. A wise person, then, will have gone through that process within themselves. Looking at their thoughts and feelings throughout their lives, perhaps, they'll be able to recognize the extremes, the reactivities, the decontextualized assumptions. They'll be able to sift those from the beliefs that are helpful, that are practically applicable, that relate to the situation or to others in it. The cognitive aspect of integration of belief can be described as wisdom, but the emotional aspect can also just equally well be described as compassion. If you think about an absolute belief of others, that's also an emotionally narrow view of others. A provisional view of others is also an emotionally open view of others. So the extremes are more likely to involve attempts to possess others or rejections of them, whereas an open view, a provisional view, is also a compassionate view. The same can often be applied to aspects of ourselves that we may reject or take a very grasping view of. The practice of the integration of belief can be outlined in terms of the 5 principles of middle way philosophy. Skepticism, to start with, the recognition that we have embodied and that we cannot have absolute views. Agnosticism, the even-handed attempt to avoid such absolute views. Provisionality, which involves both maintaining a critical view of absolutes, but also maintaining alternatives. Incrementality, recognizing that our judgments are a matter of degree and that we cannot make absolute judgments. Integration, perhaps the most important and the last here, involves the dialectical process of bringing together provisional views. Whilst we've rejected the absolute views, there has to be a positive way forward whereby those views come together and begin to address conditions better. So, to summarise, the integration of belief. Belief is a set of synaptic links in the brain, entrenched by action, creating an assumed representation, whether that's implicit or explicit. Absolute beliefs remain in fragile conflict with each other. They're bound to ultimate true or false dualisms and repressing alternatives. Provisional beliefs, on the other hand, are capable of integration. Beliefs are integrated by avoiding positive and negative absolutes, whilst engaging with associated meanings and provisional beliefs to produce more adequate new beliefs. Beliefs are also integrated by avoiding absolutized reactions to cognitive bias. Integration of belief is the basis of wisdom and compassion.